This is an interview with David Fox. It's August 8th, 2003. I'm Forrest Larson in the Lewis Music Library. It is my honor and privilege to have David Fox for an interview this morning. It's August 8th, 2003. We're in the Lewis Music Library. I'm Forrest Larson, and thank you, David, very much. You just graduated this spring, 2003, with degrees in both architecture and music, and thanks so much for coming.
Well, it's very good to be here. It's, again, after a short break.
So. All right. Starting off some of the obvious questions, tell me about where you were born and grew up.
Well, I was born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin in 1981, and I lived in the city of Milwaukee until the end of 5th grade, and then we moved to Sussex, Wisconsin, which is just west of there, and that's where I currently live.
And that's a village, at least the way I've seen it described. So.
Yes. It grew up, it's now in a suburban sort of location, like it's surrounded by a lot of suburbs, but it is, the village itself has a population of, between about 5,000 people. So it's not very, very small, but I'm used to, it's within a larger metropolitan sort of area. So.
I see. Yeah, it's like some of the villages in west of Boston.
Right.
Okay. Are there musicians and artists in your extended family or your parents and stuff like that?
My grandparents, none of them are musicians, but are proper. But I know that my mom's parents enjoyed opera and music and things while they were living in Chicago. My mom is a remedial school teacher, but has also taught music for children, elementary school age children, and plays the piano. And my father actually has his master's in church music composition from Concordia University in River Forest, and so he's been a church music director for a long time, and he was a pipe organ builder before that. Now, granted, even though both of my parents are musicians, and that's even not just an avocation, but part of their work, while providing an environment that was certainly encouraging of music, they did not take it upon themselves to be my music teachers as such. They didn't want to be, the people telling me to practice, and that sort of thing. In the same breath as to, it's time for dinner or something like that. So, while and so therefore I haven't. Sometimes people assume that, since your parents play the piano, they must have taught you a lot about that, and certainly they have been extraordinarily helpful. But it's not that they really taught me in those sorts of things. My extended family, there aren't many musicians, but my grandmother and my aunt are both visual artists and have taught art as well, and so there's more of a. So perhaps that the running family thing is that the visual art thing skipped a generation, and that's with me and my architecture and the kind of coming through with that.
Just for the record, your parents' first names?
Oh, Gary and Katie Fox.
Yeah. And I'll ask you more about your father, since he's also a composer. I'm sure there's something that you got from him. Can you tell me about some of your earliest musical experiences that you remember that stay with you today as a child?
I would remember being in, kind of church school kind of choirs, or choirs in elementary school. Mm-hmm. I didn't go to religiously affiliated schools as I was growing up, but in various, for Christmas programs and and holiday concerts and things through the spring, I remember having various. There was an annual thing where they had a large kind of cone-shaped stage that they had. It was green. It was in one of the local malls, and they would have different school groups sing as if they were in a Christmas tree, and that sort of thing. So most of the earliest things that earliest things that I would remember would be singing, either with relation to my parents or not. I did start. They had You had the option of doing piano lessons at the public school where I went for elementary school, and I think it might have been second grade or third grade, something like that, that I had begun working with that, and you had, the different colored books for whatever level you were in, and I guess throughout, I haven't necessarily found good instrumental teachers that I've worked with for long periods of time. I've, of course, the ones that I've had have been very helpful, but due to either scheduling or due to either the teachers would be not critical at all, or would have music choices that weren't to my liking and weren't very interesting, or simply that it was hard to schedule a way to get to the lessons or whatever, that I don't have like a list of of names or of people that stand out from elementary school in that way. I definitely remember from middle school, I had a teacher named Terry Fodick for choir and such, and I occasionally would play piano or percussion for that. And one of the most significant, I would say, experiences would have been in 8th grade. I was part of the Project Create Children's Choir, which is affiliated with one of the local universities, and they actually later that year ended up going to sing in Carnegie Hall, and I wasn't part of that, but because I just joined that year, but we did Carmina Burana, and we were the children's chorus, obviously, and we did a number of other very interesting. We did one Britten piece. We did the Mozart Laudate Dominum from the cave. What is that? Cave 332 or 337 Vespers, and that piece in particular, the Mozart Laudate Dominum, that was something that we had learned in choir very quickly and hadn't had time really to perfect, but as we were going around to different schools and singing on our little 5-mile tour of various schools, that we ended up rehearsing it in the bus, which was a rather interesting experience. And the piano part of that was very engaging. It was from that I decided that I wanted to go back and restart learning piano, because I really hadn't focused on it much while I was in, probably 6th and 7th grade and that sort of thing. And so it was that summer after 8th grade, that I would have been 13, I guess, that I then decided that I wanted to focus more on music, but it was because it was something that I enjoyed. It was something that was my choice as opposed to something that I had to do as an obligation.
Mm-hmm. So your piano up to that point was largely self-taught, kind of with your...
Well, I would say that the lessons in elementary school had helped in terms of basic hand motion sort of things, and I could read music. I don't have a strong memory of when I learned to read music, but I had learned it at some point, and I would say that music was something that was sort of, I enjoyed. It was on the side. I had occasionally played, when the latest Disney movie would come out, I remember I'd get the book for the music from Beauty and the Beast or Aladdin or whatever, and and play through those sort of, they weren't extraordinarily simplified, but they're more straightforward kind of lead sheet types of piano music. And I remember, and I certainly enjoyed that, but I think that the Mozart piece, which is kind of surprising because I'm not it's not that I have it's probably not the only Mozart piece that I learned over a long period of time. I've played a couple of little short things, but it's not that, it's not quite the Mozart effect. It's not that I've become a classical era music fan because of that piece in particular. It's just that it had a piano part, and it was something that I had learned through another medium, through singing it. I thought, wow, that would be an exciting sort of thing to try, challenge, to try to learn. Mm-hmm. But I guess I don't know about. I guess in many aspects it was self-taught from that on after, because I then had I thought I'd listened to piano music and I wanted to learn the Gershwin preludes, and that sounds so nonsensical now, and I think that, after learning a short little Mozart piece, that the next step would be to try Gershwin's Prelude Number 1, but that's what I did. And so from that I picked, a Chopin piece, a Rachmaninoff prelude, just things that I found interesting or had heard in, some in movies, some I'd heard in recordings and such. And it wasn't that, most of the music that we would listen to at home would be like music that we were rehearsing for church or something like that, that it wasn't so much that there were tons and tons of classical music recordings around. So that became a big part of things that I, find recordings that I liked. And, you listen to one thing that makes you interested in something else and this sort of thing. And then deciding, well, what's a challenge that I could try to learn. And so so throughout high school, when I would learn piano pieces for the state and music contest or for whatever, it would always be a kind of confusing thing, because they would ask me at the end, and who is your teacher? And I said, well, I don't really have one right now. So it was I suppose that was sort of, it's not that I wouldn't have liked to have had a teacher, but it was an important sort of thing to be able to learn as much from the music itself, given that I, had a bit of the finger thing, that I could know some basic things, but I'm still not technically very good at any of the instruments or things that I play. It's always that I can figure it out in my head much faster than my fingers can catch up with me.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of how that goes, and that's continued to the present. So,
tell me a little bit about your father's work as a musician and composer.
Well, my father was, he graduated. He got his master's in 1976, and he, I believe, was one of the first people who got the specific degree of master's in church music composition. And he worked with some really great instrumental composers and conductors and such, Professor Gard, Professor Hillard, and other people at River Forest, and he he does not so much write, I don't have a strong memory of tons of compositions in the sense that he has a list of clarinet ensemble things, or a list of this, that, and the other thing that he has done since school. What he's focused on instead is that as he directs the choirs and the instrumental ensembles, we do have a brass ensemble at our church for some occasions, that his skills in arranging for whatever performing forces are available, that is something that all of a sudden, okay, we have 2 flutes and a violin, what are we going to do on the second verse, and that kind of thing. And sometimes it's just a case of making sure that everything's transposed to the right key for whomever's playing, because while I would take things like transposition and proper clefs and that sort of thing, I can read whatever, and if I need to transpose it, I can do that. But for many musicians who play on a more amateur sort of basis, that's a very important thing to try to make it work. He has written many songs for often for particular occasions, for church events and that sort of thing. And I think that and he also is very good at combining traditional and more contemporary sorts of elements. So it's not just, I know that there are people who continue to write hymns in the sense that they are, things that mainly occur in quarter notes with 19th century tonal harmony, that occur with, standard 4-part kind of chorale-like notation, and that continue to do that to the present. And I've written a couple short things like that, but he also, the church music can also be things that are different stylistically from that. but it's actually, I would have never, if you had told me 4 years ago that I would end up with a degree at all similar to like a composition degree, I would have been a very surprised person, because that really was not something that I would have thought of at all as being a large part of, composition in particular as being a large part of what I'm about until after I had come to MIT.
I'm going to pick up that trend, or that train of thought later. So your father's a full-time church musician.
Now he's full-time. He used to tune pianos and organs and a variety of other things, and he builds Zimbelsterns, which are these little bell apparatuses. They're a mechanical thing that go with pipe organs.
Mm-hmm.
It's a German kind of tradition that he's now... It's an electronic version of, like, real handbell castings, but the mechanism is electronic.
So he has kind of an engineering kind of building background that must have influenced you as well.
Yeah, well, and again, it seems like that in retrospect, though I certainly would have never thought of that. I am not that mechanically inclined in that regard. I understand kind of how they work a little bit, but I think that what comes through is that being able to deal with not just this is what the music sounds like, but that there's a lot of physical logistics to making music work, whether it's in a machine or in a setting of trying to get all the instrumentalists assorted and trying to fit them into a tiny little church space or something like that. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of non-musical stuff that goes into music that you have to deal with in order for the music to happen. One of the more interesting things that happened is that in about, I think this is the summer after 8th grade or so, maybe it was about the same time, or maybe it was slightly earlier, but it was sometime in, between, I was 12 or 13 or something like that. One of the local high schools was getting rid of their old set of timpani, and because they were getting a better set, and so they basically asked if anybody wanted them, and my father thought, oh, well, okay, we'll take those, and so we had a set of timpani laying around, and there was one elderly woman in her 80s who had, at one point in her life, must have played timpani for something, I have no idea what, but would mark everything on the music with L's and H's for low and high, and in order to remember which drum. And these were pedal timpani that took a huge amount of effort to change. They're not like the rocker pedal kind where you can adjust it very cleanly. And there's one other person who was mainly a pianist who also occasionally played them, but very quickly I found that this was something that I liked, and I remember I think that what we would do is that my father would have the printed sheet music or a photocopy of whatever the hymn or song was, and there's plenty of tonic and dominant running around in most of those. So granted I didn't know the terminology at the time, but I got very good at tuning C and F and G and C and B flat and E flat and all sorts of fun combinations that way, so that it became an interesting sort of experiment to go to the music store and figure out what kind of timpani sticks one could get. And we promptly picked the ones that would work best for the acoustics of our church, which ended up being T4 ultra staccato timpani mallets, which, as I now know, are not the general thing that one would use for standard timpani playing. Mm-hmm. Those would be reserved for really, I can think of a couple passages in Mahler that you'd switch to something really, really hard, but generally you would use a much softer stick. But we didn't know this at the time. And we found there was some person who was gave little bits of percussion instruction, and I went to 3 percussion lessons, but she was very much a person who wanted me to be going back to working on snare, or wanted to know if I was interested in drum set or something like that, which I had no desire for whatsoever. And I still don't like playing snare drum, and even though I can do it somewhat, it's not something that I would tend to focus on. I liked that timpani had notes and that sort of thing, and that you could feel like you were part of the music as opposed to just part of the rhythm. Not that the rhythm's bad, but again, as I look back in retrospect, it's a sort of self-taught sort of aspect, because we eventually got a third timpani that doesn't match the other 2, but between the 3 you could get a variety of notes, and so there would be cases where I could hear what the bass line was doing, and by that time my voice had changed, and so I was singing the bass line instead of one of the other lines, and so being able to have, to play along during the music and church services, that it actually was something that could help lead. And this is something that I've never seen before or since, that the use of timpani or percussion instruments as, I would also play like other, depending on if there were other more contemporary songs that needed tambourine or woodblock or a variety of other, we have a little set of wind chimes and that sort of thing. But to use the timpani not just for like Handel's Messiah or for something where there's a timpani part written in, or for a brass prelude of this, that, and the other thing, but where, there's, a soft little timpani part on one stanza of Silent Night, or that there's a, that with whatever the song would be, that you're helping to trace out the bass line and follow along with what's going on with that. And even though I don't do that much anymore, that was certainly a very helpful sort of thing. Entirely different from playing timpani in an orchestra or in a band setting. And I only played timpani in band in high school for my last semester of high school. And that was so strange because you only had the timpani part. All throughout, when I would play at church, you'd have, there was no timpani parts. You'd have the whole, grand staff or grand staff plus a vocal line or whatever, with all of the music running along, and then like little red things, notes circled or added in, penciled in. And so I was very much seeing things in quote-unquote score notation and feeling that, this fits in with this, and that the bass line's going da-da-da-da-da-da, boom, and that this is where then that comes in. And so to be in a setting where all of a sudden, you're playing the band transcription of Marriage of Figaro, and you have these oodles of rests, and you have to deal with that, and that you felt so much more disconnected that, the other people have the music, and then all of a sudden, there's these couple little heroic, timpani strokes at the end, and that's what the extent of percussion would be. That's generalizing, but there's certainly percussion pieces where you are more prominent in that regard, but being a pianist or being singing in choirs and that, you always have the whole thing there, and so that was a very big difference. I'm on quite a tangent here. But
that's quite okay. Sounds like your involvement with the church music was really influential for you in ways that when you were doing it may not have been obvious to you, but it looks like it's given you a lot of really useful skills.
Yes, and not necessarily in very expected sorts of ways. Yeah. Like, a lot of what I'd be doing would be, before I play, I need to make sure that the sound system is adjusted correctly, or that the chords are running in a way that that the choir people aren't going to trip on them when they're walking back and forth in front of the timpani, or that, like, how do we figure out some way to hide the timpani behind everything so that they don't look like these big kind of shining copper things in front of the piano. And again, working with the building of how to, we have a very bizarre sort of concrete block church building, so that, like, how do you, what is the way that this is going to sound properly in the space, and like how to make sure that you're not playing too loud or too soft, that it's not working that way. That a lot of those sorts of either ensemble skills or logistical skills or whatever you would want to call it did not occur. I mean, there's no conductor running around. There's no it's not a typical formal music setting, and I would have never thought of that as quote-unquote chamber music.
Yeah.
And I would have never, I don't know that I ever thought of anything as chamber music, or would have known what that meant until I would have been at the end of high school or beginning of college, in that regard. Since then, when I've been here at MIT, I don't want to jump the gun too much, but I continued. My father is the music director at a Lutheran church, and there's a Lutheran Episcopal ministry here at MIT, and I played one of the things that I actually wrote for a service my freshman year towards the end, and the music director or the student who played the music for the services was graduating, and they asked me to take over. And so this was the first time actually I was playing piano for church, because I played piano but never for church, because there were plenty of other people that was their only instrument, that was their main focus. They were much more skilled and able to do, like, I always felt very awkward because like doing hymns at the drop of a note is a very different sort of task than learning a piece of piano music and having weeks or months to sit down and figure out the fingering of this. All of a sudden, you're confronted with these hymns that have, like, you have to be playing with a very different sort of technique, or even songs that aren't hymns. And so it wasn't until, again, like, that would have been 2.5, 3 years ago, then that playing hymns really became something that was part of my repertoire. So that, like, again, have I been doing church music, quote unquote, for more than a few years? Yes, but it's very much not the typical sort of like, I don't play the organ. I don't play, I haven't been playing hymns for oodles and oodles of years or something like that.
Mm-hmm. What about your high school musical experience? You said you played one semester in the
Yes.
in the band. Were there other musical things you did at high school?
Freshman year of high school, this would have been the summer then after I had learned that piano piece and had been in that choir. I was actually still a soprano at that point, so I was in the and since I had been focusing on singing so strongly during that year, I still had a lot of vocal control that way, and so and because I could, like, read music, they let me into the select show choir, or whatever they called it, which was not the kind of typical choir, but it was a much smaller group of people, and so we had some little musical Old MacDonald thing that we would take to the elementary schools and sing now and then, and various other sorts of things. And I did that freshman year, but it wasn't... Most of what I did in terms of music in high school would have been... I was in several musicals. I was the minstrel in Once Upon a Mattress, and I was in Once on This Island, which is by Lynn Ahrens and Stephen Flaherty, who did Ragtime and a number of other musicals, Seussical and other things, since it's an excellent musical. And incidentally, it's like I was singing for that. It's an ensemble piece, so it's not that I had a solo vocal role, but it was that we had and there were, like, I think 20 or some of us that were in the cast, and some of them would be named roles, and then those would recede back into the group, because often it's a kind of group storytelling sort of effort. And I remember that with each of these musicals that I was involved in, it was often that I would end up with some sort of other task. With Once Upon a Mattress, there's a part that's supposed to be whistled by someone who's playing the Nightingale and is dressed up in this Nightingale costume, and thankfully I did not have to dress up in a Nightingale costume. But they needed someone who could whistle in tune and memorize the part. And so then all of a sudden, it's a very interesting little modal French-ish sounding, quasi-medieval, not medieval, but like minstrel sort of tune that had been written for the musical. And so I was off stage whistling into the microphone of the piece was. And then for Once on This Island, we realized, not too far from the performances actually, that the pianist, like the person doing the music direction, is a pianist. And there was, I think there might have been a flute or a couple other people involved, but it's a very percussion-heavy score. It has a lot of Caribbean and African influences, and for reasons that are a much longer story, I happened to have a miniature conga drum that was about 18 inches long that one could hold and wear while playing. Not the kind of big one that would be on a stand. And I had brought it along at one point, and it turned out that, we needed... And of course I had the music memorized because we'd been learning the singing and the choreography and all this sort of stuff. And so I played along, they're like, can you keep doing that? And so I played what ended up happening is that it's for a bunch of percussionists, but there was only one, and I was busy being on stage, so the conga drum lived backstage in the center, just kind of, and so I would walk in, and occasionally I'd just be a normal character in the play, but then when there were numbers, I would pick up the conga drum and sing and play at the same time. That was not the easiest thing, by the way. But the thing is that it ended up being a very necessary part of the piece coming off, but there was no written score that was the actual percussion part that we were practicing. So when you're doing choreography, you practice with a CD generally. And what's printed is not there's real challenges in printing exactly what percussion notation is, and we don't have like a whole arsenal of things that can take thousands of dollars in a room full of things to be playing all over. So, well, how do you get that out of one little drum that has a range of pitch of a certain size and has a variety of different ways you can strike it? Well, I did that, and that ended up being rather serendipitous, because a few years later, then freshman year here at MIT, there was a student group that was doing the same musical, and they needed someone to do the percussion for it, and I ended up doing that. But again, this was the first time I'd ever seen the music, and it was totally baffling, because they had the percussion part sitting there. I was thinking, oh, it's in 4/4 and not in 2/4. I had never thought of it like that, or the whole way that it was written. It's just the notation of it seemed to be it was an afterthought, at least for me, because I already had it more memorized based on what it had been before. Not that I couldn't read it, but I then ended up playing along and helping when I wasn't playing, to keep the rest of everybody in sync. It was a very small production, but the musicals and such would have been, and also then like playing for state music contest, I would play timpani pieces, or piano pieces, or I also sang like Bestu by Mirrors, other kinds of things that you could enter in several categories, and so that was sort of fun.
Wow. What was some of the music that really caught your personal attention during high school? Stuff that that really moved you? And
Gershwin's Concerto in F, and Rhapsody in Blue. I now can look back on that and see. I actually just listened to the Hélène Grimaud recording of Concerto in F yesterday while I was here, and I can now identify that I liked in Gershwin that there was a harmonic complexity that was still tonal, but that had lots of other influences, and I would not consider them all to be jazz influences at all. This is me speaking as me at the present, as opposed to why I liked it then. Mainly, I think I had found a cassette that had, I think, Earl Wild or somebody, it was a very old recording, and it just seemed very energetic. What are the other pieces that were very... the pieces, because I don't there is an extraordinary wealth of music that I have not played. I didn't play one of the beginning Beethoven sonatas. I never played one of the, Scarlatti sorts of things, or I've occasionally looked at them or played through them, but I never really learned them. So that learning the Chopin E-flat Nocturne or the C-sharp minor Prelude of Rachmaninoff or some of those other sorts of pieces, that because I was choosing them in particular, that was a very particular... I was the person choosing them, so they were enough of an influence that I would have made the effort to do that. I think that I was struck by a number of the mixed meter things that we did in this one band piece that was in a strange kind of combination of 5/4 and a variety of other sorts of things, and that was one of the first times that I'd really seen what mixed meter music could entail. When I was in my last semester of high school, I was in a play that it's not a musical at all. It's Rivers and Ravines. It's a relatively small cast. It was written in 1990, I think, and it deals with the crisis of these farmers in eastern Colorado during the 1980s and their sense of community and loss and this, that, and the other thing. But there's a lot of references to music in it, from the Mickey Mouse theme to E Luceva una stella from Tosca by Puccini. There's one character who keeps listening to that. And we had to find a recording of it, and so the French teacher is also an opera buff, and he had the Maria Callas recording of that, which has Giuseppe Di Stefano singing the tenor part. It's a tenor aria. And he still is one of my favorite opera singers, and I'm not even that much of an opera buff now, but that piece, I was very struck by, okay, so you have this musical, has all these different sorts of, has all these different sort of musical things that are alluded to throughout, but it isn't something that has music to it. And we were organizing this, that play was being performed at the same time that the art club was having a display in the hallway outside of the little theater at Hamilton High School in Sussex, Wisconsin. And we then had we had a tuba quartet, we had our xylophonist playing Flight of the Bumblebee, we had an assortment of things, we had a little set of chamber music performances that I also helped to organize for this. We called it the Senior Fine Arts Display. And I had played parts of Rhapsody in Blue that I was learning at the time, and it just kind of smushed together. There's many parts of it that I can't reach, but what I could play, I played. Well, I decided to write a piece. I started just while I was not on stage, writing down musical ideas, and I occasionally carried staff paper with me throughout high school and would write down various ideas of, like, sometimes I thought I would write a piece for Christmas or something like that, and of course would never finish it until like February or something like that, so at which point it was kind of useless. But I started this idea. I thought, well, it'd be interesting to try to put these kind of musical ideas together and write something for piano that would be this. And I wrote this piece, Four Rivers and Ravines, and I, as a kind of overture, and played it then at the end of the concert, which was right before the play happened. I can now look at that and see that it's a quotation sort of piece, that it's using transformed, either rhythmically or harmonically transformed pieces from this part of America the Beautiful that is referred to. There's part of, there's a couple other hymn tunes that are referred to in the course of this, in the play. Well, I can also look back on it and realize that it never uses a dominant. It doesn't have any major five. It has five without a third. It has five with a minor third. It has a bunch of other really funny chords that I still couldn't quite analyze, but it's just that sort of analysis didn't make it. I had no idea that existed, so I simply would, figure out the chord that I would want and figure out how to play and write it down and that sort of thing. And that would, I guess, be the first piece that I would consider to be something that I wrote, aside from, like, little something that sounded kind of like Aladdin, the music from Aladdin in 7th grade, or just little things jotting down. But that would be like the first thing that I would consider to be a finished piece. Would I play it today? I don't know, but like it's that ended up being like, I thought that was a kind of one-shot sort of deal. I didn't like envision this being a major sort of piece, but this play seemed to inspire that needed a little bit of music or something like that. But that was something that ended up being a really interesting first foray into, not Gabriel Fauré, but at least a foray into composition.
So were there some other pieces that you wrote prior to coming to MIT?
Like, certainly, I had a couple, like, when I'd be playing on the timpani, I came up with a couple of ideas for things that would be, I thought, oh, this sounds cool, I wonder if this would work. I had the idea that I was curious why there were no timpani concerti out there. I since have discovered that there are, but not often in the same vein that I was thinking. But I thought, we have, I mainly thought of writing as something for piano. I can now look back that even when if I was sketching something for timpani and other instruments, I could never think of it like outside of a piano texture, if that makes sense. But I really didn't write, like, I can think of a couple little, like, they would have been, I would say, much more a sort of sketch sort of thing. There is no, like, opus 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or something right. Like that of a variety of different things. And even to know, like, I had been in the band, I had been in the choir, but, like, we did not have, I must have seen a band score at some point, but we didn't have orchestras. Like, I would have never seen an orchestra score until I came to MIT.
Did you what kinds of concerts did you go to growing up, and just your exposure to the wider world of music? What was that like?
A lot of, either church music related things, or sometimes I know we saw Bobby McFerrin and this, both being Bobby McFerrin, but also conducting the St. Paul Chamber Orchestra at one point. I really enjoyed that. I did go occasionally to see the Milwaukee Symphony, but certainly not with any frequency. There was often I think I went to more choral sorts of things, or like if there would be I mean, Carmina Burana is a good example of that. That I would have never thought to have gone to that. I would have not thought of that as a concert to, like, you know, oh, Mom and Dad, I want to go see this piece of 20th century German composition because it has, you know, interesting parallel motion and that sort of thing. That wouldn't have been like on my list of tasks. I distinctly remember when we were learning that piece that it doesn't have key signatures in the traditional sense. It has, like, it'll have 3 over quarter note or something at the top of the score. And when we learned the piece, we often thought that they were typos, like that when it would switch from 3/4 to 2/4, that we thought, oh no, that can't be a quarter note or something. Like that when we got to the performance, and all of a sudden, you know, it's going in this kind of funny mixed meter, and it was a very disjointed sort of thing. But I would have, in terms of what concerts did I go to, I don't have, like, I remember seeing, I saw the Waukesha Symphony did Scheherazade and a number of other, like, things like that, and this would have been during high school. I remember seeing one of our best French horn players playing the Mozart horn, for music contest, but playing one of the Mozart horn concerto things, and really thinking that was pretty incredible. Not so much that the piece itself was excellent or that the transcription of it was outstanding, but that, wow, that's a pretty outstanding player that can play all those notes so fast and so clearly and that sort of thing.
I want to digress a little bit, and hopefully there's a way you can describe it in brief. How did your interest in architecture develop, prior to MIT?
I became interested in architecture because I really enjoyed the kind of math and science sort of analytical perspective on things, and also that I really liked. I've been a history buff for a long time, and not in the sense necessarily of, like, going to all sorts of famous battle sites or something like that, but I like reading about things and writing about things that way. And I also then gradually ended up having more of an interest in visual art, and architecture seemed to be something that combined all of those. And remember at this point that even though we're interviewing in a music library, that music was very much a sort of thing that happened on the side. It was not at all something very primary, so that I thought that this would be an interesting sort of thing to do, and I had started, like, sketching little house plans or making little models. You could buy little paper models of houses in stores. Basically, the short version is that why my interest in architecture is kind of where it is now, is that I thought, well, if you're interested in biology, you take biology classes. You're interested in writing, you write while you're in high school. I'm interested in architecture. You can't take architecture in high school. You can take drafting. That's not the same thing. I should go and travel and see different pieces of architecture. And so en route to seeing family or visiting different people, I would figure out, well, there's this place I've read about, maybe we could stop there. And one place led to another, and this is how I became interested in photography, because I figured I should if I've been there, I might as well take a picture and try to figure out what it is. One thing led to another, and 600 some places later, I came to MIT. That I ended up seeing a very non-standard history, mainly of early 20th century residential architecture in the Midwest and Northeast. And then I learned design through various summer programs and little things to explore architecture along the way. But it was not necessarily through, like, I really liked building decks, or I liked, we had done a lot of house remodeling. That's not the case. It's more through the study and the experience and visiting and that sort of aspect. And that's become very strong even to the present.
Mm-hmm. So when you when you applied to MIT and came here, you were primarily thinking of architecture.
Yes, and I definitely was intending on majoring in architecture. I took a seminar in it first semester freshman year, and also thought for my HASS distribution course that I'll take Intro to Western Music, which is 21M011, And even though it's constantly made fun of by the more senior members of the music faculty, I really enjoyed that class because even though I was interested in music, like I'd never heard like Perotan or Mush or any of that kind of stuff, and I really hadn't heard a lot of like any like Brahms or other sort of thing. There are all sorts of random holes in what I had ever heard, and so that course was really a very helpful sort of thing, because even though it was a survey, that's kind of what I needed at that point.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I also had Dante Anzolini as my recitation instructor, who was one of the more... He had played or conducted almost every piece that we were listening to, but he was too disorganized to find where that piece was to point out, the recording. So it was an interesting introduction to Dante at that point as well. So.
We'll get more into him later. I have a question for you there. When you first came to MIT, I remember when you came to the music library, you had a particular interest in the music library, but it also made me think that there was something musically astute about you as well. What were your plans for music at MIT when you came here? What were you?
I was thinking that I very much was conscious that it had a good music program, that there was a good music program here.
You did know about it.
I did know that, and that was part of my decision that I wanted to be at a place where I could pursue other interests and not feel like I was stuck in architecture 24/7. Mm-hmm. And I did not understand. Like, I think that one thing had mentioned John Harbison's name, who I had not heard of at that point. There was a variety of other little things that way, but I thought, oh, well, maybe I'll take a few classes, and then eventually towards, end of freshman year, I thought, well, maybe I'll do a minor. It seems easy, and it seems to be not easy enough, but like it's not a structural impossibility. And of course, I started working in the music library at the beginning of freshman year, and that ended up continuing for all 4 years. And I thought that was a good sort of thing, because it meant that it was paid decently. They were friendly people to work with, and it meant that I could also learn something about something that was a bit of an academic interest that was kind of on the side. Of course, I ended up with a double major and got, finished the complete major, not a joint major, in music, so that was a pretty big change.
Mm-hmm.
Big modulation there.
Can you briefly describe some of your other, work in other visual arts media besides architecture, painting, and photography and stuff like that?
Well, a lot of it kind of it's hard to completely separate from the architecture, or the other way around, that like I've done many watercolor sketches for building design or for studio projects, or photographs of... So much of what I learned in terms of photographing buildings or photographing models has come out when I then simply am doing photography and traveling or of different objects. Incidentally, a strange connection to music is that the photograph on the cover of the MIT Undergraduate Research Journal that I had given to you is a photograph of the inside of a percussion instrument. So, they meet in strange ways. But I've had several... I mainly focus in watercolor, a little bit of acrylic, and in drawing media, and mixed media, of course, between those. And I've had several art shows in both in Wisconsin, and been part of ones here at MIT and in Boston in general. And I actually just got back from a trip to France, where I was studying as part of a visual art program in drawing and painting in southern France. So that the visual art component would be something that was very much towards the side. I've taken art classes, but I don't have a large studio art background beyond what I had done in high school and smaller short-term sorts of things during the past 4 years of college. And I found that that's actually much more helpful for where I was at, that I wanted to be... When I would have time to focus on that, I could, but that when I needed to be focusing on other academic sort of things, I could then see how I could apply what I knew in photography or visual art in a more as kind to serve what I needed academically in architecture.
Mm-hmm. I want to pick up a little later about when you came to MIT, and obviously there are different things you can specialize in if you are a music major and what led you to composition. But I want to backtrack a little bit, and I have some specific questions about some of the performing activities. But
Sure.
you want to just give me kind of an overview of the groups that you played with, because there's probably some stuff that I don't know about
Sure.
that you've done.
Let's see. I very naively auditioned for the MIT Symphony Orchestra my freshman year, and surprisingly made it in as a percussionist, even though I'd never been in an orchestra before. And I can now realize, and that was a very, very helpful experience beyond what I could have imagined it would have turned into. So I was in Mezzo for freshman year and parts of sophomore and junior year. I was in Wind Ensemble or Wind Symphony, or it's had several names, with Fred Harris over parts of sophomore and junior year. I was in the MIT Chamber Choir with Bill Cutter for parts of junior and senior years, and I played, I did a chamber music piece that was for flute and percussion with Ole Nielsen that was a premiere of a piece that Charles Shadle had written. I have been the music director for the Lutheran Episcopal Ministry for the past few years and have played for them for 3. And I played with Once on This Island. That was the only theater music that I did while I was here. I then had my final recital that I did at Baker House with Ida Volkis-Ortiz, who's a violinist. And I think that's pretty much the extent of what I've played. I don't know if I'm missing something.
Were there some miscellaneous accompanying things you did for recitals?
Yeah, I played a little bit. I also was part of the Young Composers Ensemble while that existed, and I accompanied for one of my own pieces that someone else was singing. That was sophomore year. And I actually didn't do as much kind of random accompanying for performance, but I have read through a number of things like with friends or with various things that way. And then, of course, senior year, the Stephen Prokopov donation concert was a very big part of things, both in terms of library activities and also in terms of performing.
Right.
I guess the common thread would be that I didn't do one thing for 4 years, and that wasn't because I was for being indecisive. A lot of it had to do with scheduling, and a lot of it had to do with wanting to try to learn the most from each opportunity.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. When you played with the MIT Symphony Orchestra under Dante Anzolini, can you tell me some of the things that you learned from him that have stayed with you as both a performing musician, pianist, but also as a composer? I'm sure there's a lot that's kind of rubbed off.
Right.
On you.
Well, first of all would be the pieces that we did. First concert included the Elgar Enigma variations. Second concert was the Schnittke Viola Concerto in Mahler's Fifth. Then Rite of Spring, West Side Story, La Valse, Daphnis and Chloe, Beethoven's Fifth Piano Concerto. I did the timpani for that. The choice of music is so decisive and incisive, I suppose, but very, very particular sort of thing. Being able, I don't know that I would have ever understood how Mahler works if I hadn't taken the time of listening through all of those rehearsals. And the thing is that when you're a percussionist, very often you are listening through a lot of those rehearsals. That it's not, and we generally have decent seats too, that there's not, so much of what I got out of that, through the whole Enigma variations, I probably played fewer than 20 notes. There's not that many cymbal crashes in it. And some of them are probably wrong as well. But the thing is that I got a chance to see, all the details with, figuring out bowings with the violins, all the little tempo changes, the idea that, of what the role of a conductor was, of trying to explain how the balance of the different instruments was going to work for, building up in the Nimrod variation, the big adagio thing. The way that, like, the different tempos related, all sorts of things. Like, I had never been in an orchestra. I was completely baffled that the violins were in tune. I found that to be like, and so when the fact that they were in tune at all seemed to be such an incredible thing, I thought that was, they're such good musicians. And then when he would be so critical of them that, they're not together, they have no idea what they're doing, they can't find their place, I thought, well, it sounded, at first it sounded good to me. I mean, it took a long time for me to be able to understand what were the kinds of musical issues that one could actually listen for, because I was simply listening thinking, oh, that sounds pretty good, and not really listening carefully to all of the little different things of why the bassoon has to go slightly sharp in order to tune to the piano in the Beethoven piano concerto. The idea that E flat isn't the same thing for every instrument, and that a piano isn't, the idea that E flat and D sharp could be different was mind-boggling for one thing. But I would say, and of course that same year I had him for 20th Century Music in the spring, and you could do your assignments for that either as written papers or as compositions. And I just I don't know what exactly gave me the idea that I could do this, but I thought I would. And so, like, you'd listen to the first assignments, you'd listen to a bunch of Ravel and Debussy and different things that, to learn about French Impressionism. And I hadn't played I had played some Ravel and some Debussy along through high school, but not a great deal. And I thought, well, but this is interesting music, I'll write something in this style. And that ended up being one of these pieces that with a bit of revision, ended up being fairly finished piano piece, and as I can now look at it, has quite a bit of me that isn't just like, it's not just a copy of like a bunch of pentatonic chords stacked together and then a bunch of diatonic stuff at the end. It's not just a formulaic sort of thing, but I found that very comfortable, whether writing like for something Impressionism, something that was kind of a post-romantic sort of thing, a little bit of something that tried to be Stravinsky-ish, the Were You There variations, which ended up being variations on a hymn tune that I was very much influenced by the Concord Sonata, and and all sorts of things that way, that it's hard to separate out, like, what, in terms of Dante the musician, Dante the teacher, Dante the, like, in this case, looking at composition. I'll never forget, he put one of my pieces, because when people would turn in pieces, he would play them for the class, and the way that he would analyze them was totally different from how I had ever thought of when I was writing it down. It's like, well, I didn't think that was an added seventh, ninth, or anything. It was just that it's two parallel fourths, and that's what happens to be in the bass. They're two separate layers. In other words, I was conceiving things as, separate layers, thinking of, like, the Debussy prelude, like Wall, or something like that. And he was then looking at how they stacked up vertically, and I thought, oh, this is an interesting sort of thing. Of course, at the same time, I was in 21M301 and was, for the first time, learning what tonic and dominant meant, which, now that I look back on that, was a rather bizarre semester. Because, like, I had been, I was writing, like, little four-part harmony sorts of things that were about 4 measures long, and trying to learn how to do that without parallel voices, and meanwhile writing Debussy music where it's all, quasi-Debussy music, where there's all of these huge parallel things zooming along in many octaves and with all sorts of, like, Lydian added things that I'm surprised it turned out at all coherently.
Wow. There's some later questions I want to ask you about in relation to your early compositional experience. That's
part of the thing also is that was when I had Charles Shadle for 21M301 for that first harmony and counterpoint class, and at one point I brought in one of the pieces, the Were You There one, that the piano piece that I'd written for Dante's class, and that was the one that I ended up playing for church at one point, and I probably played that among the most of other things I've written, some because it works well. it's not too long, not too short, and it's been it's a piece that I happen to still like. And he was very helpful in realizing that I had picked up on something that was larger than a 21M301 sort of issue. And while he did not at all let any of my counterpoint errors slide as a result, he wasn't going to diminish the rigor of that. Began taking an interest in what I was writing of my own music, and he's been one of the most helpful teachers that I've ever had in that regard. And so I've ended up, when that next October, which is a year after I'd first been in the MIT Symphony, Dante asked Charles if he thought that I could write a piece, that if I could learn to write a piece for the orchestra. And the net result is that Dante did ask me to write a piece for the orchestra, and Charles helped me learn about orchestration sort of things, and then Mizzo played that piece of the Lake then the next May, or at least excerpts from it, and that was so that I was still working with Charles I've had him for a few classes, but then I had begun working with him on a more individual sort of basis. It wasn't so much that now today we're going to do the trombone line and we're going to that he would walk me through the process, but that he was very helpful for answering questions and for he wasn't afraid to tell me when something was really simply not working. And because I couldn't always tell that and be able to have any sort of clue of what was going on because I had such people here assumed I had much more orchestral or music experience than I actually did in that sort of direction, a composition direction, or simply an orchestral sort of direction. So it was a very quick learning curve in that regard to go from being in the orchestra to writing for it within a little over a year.
Well, you seem to absorb things very, very quickly, and that has stood you well for your.
It's kind of
time
almost
here.
a necessity for some things at MIT, or for learning how to, learning how to grasp material fast enough so that you can move on to, whatever it's preparing one for.
But even how you're able to absorb various musical languages, like that piano piece, the variations on "They Were There," that there's the even before you mentioned to me, I heard kind of the Ives influence, but yet it's not a copy of Ives in any way at all. But there are some things there that said, that really caught my ear.
And that piece is essentially, that's not too different from how I turned it in as a class assignment, halfway through second semester. There's a couple little things that changed, but essentially that's pretty much how it was.
And this says a lot about Charles as far as not insisting that you write things that are in this very kind of sterile academic mode of imitating Mozart and Beethoven first, and because you had a chance to let your imagination go as you were learning.
And instead imitating it later. I mean, my last assignment would have been, my last assignment for 21M304, the last composition course that I took, was a string quartet in a very Mozartian sort of style. And that was also for Charles. And so at the same time that I'm busy writing stuff for my recital and doing other sorts of things that are in many different styles, that then towards the end to return to something, and that it's not just that you have to get past Mozart before you can get to Ives, that you can it was quite an incredible task to then figure out, how do I write something that's that stylistically clear, that's that all the details and all the rigor of this worked out in a way that where you can't just insert a 5/4. You can't just add another 5 notes to the chord. You have to figure out how to solve the musical problems and get this to work in a way that is within a given style. And I think that his own music is very comfortable in many different styles. He's not somewhat he uses that variety of styles as part of his compositional language, and I think that's I think that's a good lesson, because I would hope that when I'm writing music for church or for orchestra or for like something for theater or for something for like I wrote a small piece that was for accompanying an architecture film project. I would hope that I would be able to treat those differently. I would hope that I would not think that the solution to all of that would all sound the same amount of harmonic density, to have the same amount of rhythmic drive. I would not want to be able to, that, oh yeah, there's another piece that sounds like, for as much as I like John Adams' music, or like, Ives' music, or like, a number of things, sometimes it's so recognizable that it's great when you discover that those composers can do things different as well, that they're not just, about a certain sort of, oh yeah, I've heard, like even Gershwin, that, is it recognizably Gershwin? Yes, but it can be a whole variety of different things depending on what the music was needed for and that sort of thing.
Right. Can you talk about your experience with MIT Wind Ensemble under Fred Harris? Any particular moments and experiences that stand out for you?
Well, Fred is a percussionist, and so that was an interesting sort of thing, because whereas Dante is not, that Fred was more attentive to specific percussion sorts of issues, and we did some percussion ensemble sorts of pieces, Gainsborough and Gift of the Medube and some of these other things. I was struck by how while there were some pieces that I was very engaged with, there were some, just as with orchestra, but that there's some gaps in wind ensemble literature that, like, I've learned that I'm not a fan of Percy Grainger, and of many other, that there's some, that learning that being part of an ensemble is that there's going to be some pieces that you really like, and there's some pieces that are less to one's liking. But Fred was very helpful in terms of, seeing, he helped with, he did a little conducting seminar over IAP that one could just learn a little bit about conducting, and that was I am not yet at all a conductor, but that was a very interesting sort of exploration. And I think that, we also then ended up doing Evan Ziporn's clarinet concerto, bass clarinet concerto, and that's a piece that took me a long time to understand it all, but that was a very percussion intensive sort of thing, both because that's how Evan writes, but also because that's what we needed. And so I think that being able to see more of a range of what percussion could be was helpful in that regard.
Mm-hmm. What about your experience with the MIT Chamber Chorus with Bill Cutter?
That was a very enjoyable and really great experience to be back singing. There's a lot of downtime when you're doing percussion, and it was really nice to be back and doing it in something instrumental. Something musical, where you're really having to pay attention to tuning and ensemble coordination together. Because the thing is that in percussion, it's rare that you're having to blend with another instrument. One of the best examples of that was with Fred, just to back up for a moment, was when we did there's a concert for Gunter Schuller's 75th birthday. I was playing the timpani for that, and there was, it's a Gunter Schuller timpani line, which requires every single note is tuned, there's no B flat, E flat kind of sort of thing. There's, it required all sorts of melodic things to be done with the timpani, and atonal, or relatively atonal things that you had to be able to tune wide leaps and all sorts of things that way. And that was one of the few times that I'm trying to blend with the trombones or something like that. But that's very unusual in percussion. Switching to chamber choir, now all of a sudden it became that, really focusing on singing, not just for a sight singing sort of idea for or vocal ear training, whatever, for for composition or for harmony and counterpoint, but where, we're doing these Bach motets and learning, wow, when I'm singing this, I can really understand how the texture of the music is working in a way that just from listening, it would almost be sensory overload. That when we, the Frank Martin pieces that we did Dido and Aeneas, that learning how to do, how to understand things about harmony, about like the real blending of different forces that happen so much with other instruments but don't happen as much with percussion, that, or with piano for that regard, because you can't, if the note's out of tune, you can't change it on a piano as much or as easily, whereas, realizing how to, get everything very precise. And Bill's also a very energetic and lively sort of person that made it a lot of fun.
Mm-hmm. Did you sing any of his music when you were in the chorus?
Yeah, we did one of his pieces of church music, which seems to be the recurring motive of this conversation. We did it for, like, we traveled and did a couple of concerts where our accompanist is Karen Harvey, is the music director at a church. We did one of his, I think a version of For Unto You a Child is Born, something like that. And we also read through some of his Herrick poems and things. And that was also, to be conducted by the person who wrote the music is it's subtle differences. Because, one can know the music extraordinarily well, even if you didn't write it, but it's you know in a different sort of way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Are there things you learned from him that will stay with you as a musician and composer? That you can
one can conduct with the other hand and still figure out a way to be leading the. He sometimes conducts in a very different sort of manner, and that was at first it was a bit confusing, but it's a good thing to understand that there are different ways of leading, different ways of learning music. In terms of, do you try learning the piece all the way through in order? Do you grab the various sections and then try to put them back together? I certainly would. I think that a lot of the lessons from that would be also things about how it's important to. Singing is a much more, it's the whole rest of your body that's involved as well. And I think that's also he's, in terms of making sure that, with warm-up exercises and that sort of thing, which is, percussion is also very physical, but in a different sort of way, mostly in terms of trying to move those darn heavy things. Yeah. But there's, I think that, and also, of course, I've sung with we did the Ives Fourth Symphony, and I was singing as part of that, and that getting a chance to learn an Ives piece, not just from hearing it, but from being in it and being a part of it, and that was Dante conducting, so that Dante sitting down and being able to, look at the score of Ives Fourth Symphony and play a suitable piano version of what was going on is kind of, that's a feat in and of itself, but that's a piece that I had enjoyed before I had been in it, but getting a chance to see, okay, well, these are the types of, issues that when you're trying to sing in it, and singing with an orchestra as opposed to just, choral stuff in and of itself. I think those are all valuable lessons. And
wow. Besides studying with Charles Shadle, and we'll get back to him shortly, you also studied with John Harbison and Edward Cohen. Can you tell me about some of your experiences with them and things that you learned from them?
Sure. I had Ed Cohen for my second harmony counterpoint class. He's a much quieter and more subtle person than Charles is, and that ended up being, I believe, one of his last classes before he became ill and passed away shortly the year after. And I was, I believe also that Charles had studied with Ed Cohen when he was at Brandeis. And so there's a kind of interesting sort of twisty tangle of teachers there. But Professor Cohen was, I think, what I appreciate so much about people in the music department as a whole is that even if they realized that I had talents in these other sort of projects that I was working on. That was the semester I was starting to think about the orchestra piece, and I was writing a percussion piece. I was writing a number of other things that they still wanted to make sure that I had learned as much as possible from the things that were more exercises. That when writing a set of piano variations, that, could I have done a set of, at that point I had heard the Rejevsky People United. I wasn't planning on writing anything at that kind of scale, but I could have thought of piano variations and said, well, no, I'm not going to write in a tonal idiom at all. I'm going to, do a whole fragmentary sort of thing. But I'm really glad that while I was in an academic sort of setting, that, he wanted me to take that as far as I could within the bounds, within the design of the scope of what that assignment was. I had John Harbison then the next semester, for the next class that I had, and similarly, he actually allowed quite a bit of stylistic freedom and allowed a lot more tonally outlandish sort of things than would have been allowed both before and after in harmony and counterpoint sort of settings, but was still very perceptive of being able to. I think that one of the commonalities that I've seen with the really good teachers that I've seen is that, and this is true in architecture as well, is that instead of trying to make you write or design or do whatever in their style, I know what John Harbison's music sounds like. I played when the orchestra did Great Gatsby, the overture. But being able to, in the amount of time that it takes to place the music on the piano and decipher what the handwriting looks like, to be able to say, these measures are going in a direction and that one is then going backwards. And you need to change that because it's not, that's not a progression. That's it's going someplace and then it can't decide what it wants to do and then all of a sudden we're back. That being able to understand almost from the inside out, instead of looking at it and say, I'd rather have a chord with a added 13th there just because that would sound cool. It's very easy to say, well, this is what I would do here. It's something very different as a teacher to be able to see, okay, well, this is the pattern you've set up. I think I'm beginning to understand what this is, even though it's not complete. But to try to say, okay, this is, in order to make it more consistent or to make it, or I also got marked down by Professor Harbison for being too normative. I got this movement of the string, I think a minuet, or it was some piece that it simply was proceeding far too much as was expected. That it needed the moments when all of a sudden there were surprises, or it went in a very different harmonic or textural direction, that those were good, but that everything was far too correct throughout, and that was an interesting thing to get marked down for. But I can understand where that comes from. It's not that everything needed to be blatantly wrong, but that you had to, if you just kept playing by the rules forever, you would have it wasn't going to be the most musical decision.
You spoke earlier about working with Charles Sadel, and you worked a lot with him. Are there some lasting kind of musical values that you learned from him that stay with you, or just things that when you're composing that you will be with you for your lifetime?
Well, I think one would be that what I'd said before, that it's a good thing to be comfortable in many different styles. For as much as there's a lot of things about John Harbison's music that I really enjoy, there's some of it tends to, it has a certain level of harmonic complexity that is rarely simpler than. And it often goes more complex, but being able to understand that it was an okay thing to all of a sudden have a moment in a piece or an element to a piece that was extraordinarily tonal, either for like as a musical gesture or to fit, like thinking of Charles's opera, Coyote's Dinner, or some of the other things he's worked at, where all of a sudden the musical style is the element in and of itself. That like this very outlandish 12-tone thing goes with this character, and this sort of marching music goes with the other one, and this, you know, seductive tango-ish or like other sorts of, you know, more complex sort of things follows with another character. That he also has helped me to understand the difference between like things that are structure and things that are effect. That that at a certain point, there's like in the orchestra piece or in the chorale variations, the chamber orchestra piece that I worked with him on, which is probably one of my most major works that I've done to this point, that deciding, okay, at this point we need a big crescendo of something, a big kind of, there needs to be an effect there. Every single little note is not important to the sense that, important in the sense that we need to hear that the sextuplet is happening against the triplets underneath, against the 16th notes in the violin or something like that. That's right now what we need is an effect, for dramatic effect, for structural effect, that it's this big preparation for a very clear downbeat. We just need a lot of, not noise, but a lot of complexity before something simple. And learning to understand when that would work, or in terms of orchestration sorts of things, that he's mentioned many times, you know, that a lot of what orchestration is about effect, that it's not, and that helped so much then when I would be then playing in a Ravel piece, or playing in a or in something else. When you think of like the bird things that are happening in Daphnis and Chloe, or the some of the other things in Mahler, that the orchestration itself is the effect. That it's not that low oboe note is interchangeable with it being played by a viola or a trombone. It needs that low growling oboe sound. It's not just another D flat. Mm-hmm. Or that we have, or that like in Daphnis and Chloe, that you have all these different layers of things running around, and that it's not that's a melody. That's not something that we need to know every detail about, but that's, you know, a little gesture that's on the side. And I think that was I don't know that I would ever have thought of things that way, but that makes, you know, that's actually how a lot of percussion writing is. Sometimes it's about the structure, it's about the harmonic outline, about where the piece is going. And right now I'm working on a transcription of his New England seasonal cantata, a piano transcription of it for rehearsal purposes. And when I was meeting with him yesterday, that was one of the more important things of trying to figure out, you know, well, what's important here. We can't transcribe the whole thing. You know, what parts are really essential for listening and for following along. I think that that's been something that has stayed with me, even though, you know, some of his music I have a lot of understanding of because I've either played it or heard it. Others that I'm not familiar with, and it's not even that my music really sounds like his at all. Right. But I think that's it. I think that's been one of the strongest sort of things, is that because it doesn't sound, we don't write similar kinds of music necessarily, that conversation could be a very meaningful one.
Mm-hmm. You wrote an article for the MIT undergraduate music journal called
Research Journal.
Or Research Journal, yes, right here. Called Merge, or MURJ.
Yes.
It's published in fall of 2002, and it raises a lot of interesting questions. And you start off looking at some of the shared language and terminology between music and architecture. And to quote you, you said, parallels between architecture and music show that it is the descriptive semantic language that is shared rather than the actual content. And that's a really insightful observation there. I have a number of questions about that, but do you want to just comment about what kind of brought you to looking at that issue?
Well, a lot of people would ask me, well, have you heard the quote from Goethe or from whomever that architecture is frozen music? And I didn't know if I had thawed yet or not. But if the frozen music had thawed into architecture, if it was just kind of melting or what it was doing. Other times people wanted to know if I was interested in acoustics or concert hall design or something like that because I have these two interests. I actually have many more than that, but these were the two that I was pursuing as majors, and these are valid questions. But what I realized is that people would say, "Oh, they actually kind of go together because they deal with, they both have rhythm and like there's, are they? We talk about like orchestra." I'll never forget the first day of architecture studio. That architecture is orchestrating tectonics to create a sense of place, or there's a sense of all sorts of musical terms or words that are used. And what I realized is that it's actually what I said, the descriptive language, that's what makes that interesting. It's not that like when you're thinking about the rhythm of windows or of elements in architecture that you're tapping out like an actual rhythm.
Right.
But there's the visual rhythm, or that the rhythm, how fast do you go through, like, is it a bunch of hallways one after another? Is it, when we would talk about this, or even the idea of orchestrating, the idea that when you're an architect, you're trying to coordinate all these different elements of the structure and the systems and the light and the form and the materials and all sorts of things that way. Are there any violas involved? I don't think so. Not often in architecture.
Yeah.
But is it important to understand, like, these are really issues of hierarchy, of creative synthesis and this, that, and the other thing. And I began then looking at how I could examine that in a more, in a written format, using a totally different medium of written language, but trying to describe how that descriptive language was similar between them. Because for me, I don't find that like I want to write music about my buildings or something like that, or that I'm inherently interested in, if I designed a concert hall or something, that might be interesting, but not inherently just because it involves music. I think that there's a lot more that you can learn in terms of trying to, with both architecture and music, you, as the composer, as the architect, you're not necessarily the final producer of the project. There will be other performers, or there will be other builders. So it's a communicative sort of thing. You're trying to communicate the design or the intention or the content of the piece for someone else to make, and so therefore it's very different from like comparing music and poetry, where the poet writes the poem and there it is, or comparing architecture with visual art, where generally if you're a painter, you are the person doing the actual work. You're not just instructing other people. Sometimes you do, but you're not just instructing other people to do it, where it would be rare for the architect or the composer in and of themselves to be the only performing force, the only building force involved. And so that was part of why I decided. I wrote that article for a variety of reasons, and for something that had occurred and that there had been the possibility of earlier, and then I decided earlier that calendar year, and then I submitted it, and it was part of the merge in the fall.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. This similarity between the languages, they're obviously metaphorical and poetic, but as you point out, some people have tried to find literal correspondences between the two, which leads to confusion. Do you find them, the metaphors between the two, helpful, if it's seen metaphorically?
Yeah, I think it can be. I think I'm not trying to be wishy-washy here, but I think that it can, even in examining when someone tries to make a literal equivalency of like something that's kind of synesthetic, that, you know, this space sounds like a trombone playing an E flat, that's a forte or something like that. I'd still be interested as to what it is that would make someone want to describe it in that sort of manner. But I think that there's a much stronger comparison in terms of creative process, and even about some of the issues that we've talked about here about, do you do things in a certain style, in a, you know, in terms of stylistic imitation, before branching out into other things, or what's the relationship there? And so realizing that, you know, when we think of, you know, we study and make quote unquote Bach chorales in music, you know, harmony counterpoint sort of settings, and yet, as Debussy points out, and as I quoted in the article, that Bach would have been the last to have been following many of the rules that we would, you know, ascribe to, or would analyze or add on. And that there's this kind of tension of how do you, you know, I think right now there are still many elements of music that are taught with this sort of, you know, working within a set style, and that it would be like, whenever I was writing these pieces that were more on my own, like the 20th century music class, or the pieces I wrote for Charles, but, you know, kind of, these were all sort of independent sort of things. They were not within an academic prescribed sort of assignment sort of setting. And meanwhile, on the other side, in architecture, they assume that, you know, people are just designing based on that, when we're not coming in with a knowledge of all the orders of columns and this, that, and the other thing, and that, you know, we're just designing based on the materials and the program and the you know, the kind of facts and figures of what we need to do, and that presumably we're doing so without stylistic preconceptions. But realistically, when you get down to the nuts and bolts of it, you know, we're not the first people to have ever used columns, or to ever use steel in a certain way, or to ever use a certain set of forms. That it, you know, the way that we're taught shows, you know, makes us, that there is actually a bit of a stylistic, I don't say like ulterior motive, but, you know, there's a certain style to what one is creating. So do you acknowledge that up front and then work out of that, or do you kind of work with the assumption that there isn't a stylistic overriding goal, and then gradually develop something out of that? They're really complex issues, and they're not. And part of what also makes them confusing is that outside of academic architecture and academic music, there are whole huge worlds of architecture, of things that are built, of music that is played, that is not typically thought of in an academic sort of way.
Right.
And so these are really complex sorts of things, and I think that the fact that you can keep finding the parallels are not so much that, you know, a suburban ranch house does not sound like pop music, but one can make the comparison and say, okay, how, you know, with something that is far more has proliferated throughout the country, it's something that there's a lot of this, that there's a lot of consistency, and there actually is if you sit down and analyze it, there's a style to both of these things. There are elements that you can identify, but these weren't created with the kind of, like, someone saying, you know, well, how shall we, you know, make the 2x4 so that it expresses the structure of the suburban drywall. That's not really what's going on, and I think that tension, that's one of the things that I'm currently kind of thinking about, that, like, where does the analysis or that stop? Because if I can, you know, find these elements, or, you know, sit down and be analyzing an Ives piece, or analyzing a Ravel piece, or something like that, well, you know, what can I find and still glean from that's interesting from music that, you know, some people may say, oh, that's just pop music, or that's just movie music, or that's just something like that. That how can you find things of value in what's around you, and same thing happens in architecture. Like, not everything is designed by an architect. You just, there's that house at the corner that has really cool stonework, and I'll never know who did that, but, that's a really fun thing to be able to learn from.
Mm-hmm. I'm getting back to your article in
Mm-hmm.
Merge. The way that you use the word design, and you're looking at how it's used, making comparison between the two disciplines, and it certainly struck me. The musicians that I have been around in the education I had, we rarely used the word design. And if it's used, it's used in a very narrow sense of the word, referring to rigidly fixed forms. And for you, it's a very different thing. And can you talk about your how you use that word design and how it refers to the process of composition, because you use it in an active kind of form or an active way, but can you talk about the relationship between design and music and architecture?
Well, the way that I use it is, I said in the article that music is rarely thought of as the design process, and when I'm thinking about like designing a building or some sort of or a landscape element or something like that, sometimes one way of thinking about it is just in terms of its geometry or in terms of the shape and size of things. But another way of thinking about it is to say, well, what if you entered it and it had this kind of very open, airy, sort of ambiguous sort of feeling. Then as you get farther in, that it becomes actually quite dark and confined. That there's little kind of hints of what the spaces are on the other side of the walls, but that then after going through this, a certain type of, an experiential contrast, basically, that then there's some third element, and then let's think about what that third element would be. So then thinking about that as the design would be, what are those elements? What are the materials that go along? Is the material that you start with at the beginning, does it ever come back? I'm thinking literal, like wood, stone, plastic materials. Does that are they completely different from one to the next? How do the transitions occur? Are they elided? Are they kind of blurred? Are they very abrupt? These are issues that, frankly, we could, you could describe some parts of, anything, Barrio Sinfonia this way. You could describe any number of musical pieces, even to the point of, like, something as typically classical as, Beethoven's Fifth or something like that. That thinking about how elements recur, how the transitions happen, and thinking of it before or almost aside from, there's an E flat there, but thinking of it instead as, well, I want to have this sort of really, rhythmically driving sort of entrance, and that there's going to be, that even as the tempo changes of the stuff underneath it, there's another layer, or there's a slower sort of melody that's emerging out of that fast rhythmically driving section will, keep reappearing through whatever's in the middle. And, when I think about Britten's pieces, or about a number of, some Ives pieces, I'll always be a Ravel fan in many regards, but there's a sense that, it's not just that, we're building towards a climax and then there's a conclusion or something like that. The Britten Double Concerto for violin and viola, there's a whole way that at the end of this kind of Tarantelle 6/8 in the last movement, that there's a very abrupt sort of, emerging out of this very loud orchestral stuff, that then there's this little texture that is reminiscent of the beginning, but very, very soft. And it has such, I would think of that as such in a very spatial or architectural sort of manner, because you have something that's very big, and then all of a sudden there's a return to something from the beginning, but in a much smaller sort of sense, that is this going to come out of like theme and variation form? No. Is it going to come out of a last movement that happens to use lots of things in grouping of three and like other sorts of concerto conventions? Not necessarily, but like thinking of it like this is the orchestrate. It's a combination of the orchestration, the harmonic movement, and all these sorts of things that it goes back to what I talked about with Charles and effect and all sorts of things that way. It's not something that I have, as you can tell, it's not something that I have a very short, clear explanation for.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that that's an important sort of thing to consider, like not just do you want to write a piece that's in this form, but really what is the identity, what's the kind of personality that each of those sort of things have, because that can be part of what makes the music exciting and interesting and not aimless. I think there's a lot of contemporary music, music that is written in the present tense, that it feels either monotonous or it's hard to follow. Like, is there a, when are we going someplace and when are we not going anywhere? And I think that one of the things that helped me to understand listening to other people's music was to think of it in this sort of sense that, oh, well, it's not just that you have first theme, second theme, and development, but that you have, introduction to something that's going to come back later. There's going to be, you could even describe sonata form in this sort of design process sort of thing, but it's much more based on the experience of what it is to hear it, as opposed to what is the, okay, I'm getting this theme from the retrograde inversion of the fugue subject in the beginning, and I'm trying to, fit this back in together with the oboe or something like that. It's not just about what the details are from a compositional standpoint, but what's it like to really experience the music, and how can the listener make connections. It's like in my orchestra piece that, yeah, there's a recapitulation at the end, but the important thing is that you're feeling a melody that you've heard, a slow melody that you haven't heard in a very long time, now with all of the fast stuff that has been going on since underneath that slow melody, that you have two elements you've experienced separately, and now you're experiencing them together.
So for you, the difference between organization and design is, for you, design is the experience. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, that's...
Or it's very focused on what you can actually hear. Not necessarily what you can hear on the first listening, but what you can actually discern, as opposed to, like, there's a, that twisted throughout this is, like, the theme from some other piece that we've never heard of being played backwards and upside down. I think that, like, for as much as I appreciate knowing and learning and being able to understand the way that something is put together in a, like, score reading sort of sense, I think it's still really important what it actually sounds like.
And that's missing from a lot of traditional musical analysis, but there's more and more of that coming into play. And,
right.
But your way of looking at, now that I understand what you mean by design, that's a really interesting perspective on that. In this Merge article, you also are looking at the education, the collegiate education of composers and architects, and how that's changed over time. Some interesting observations. We can't get into all the questions that it raises for me, but I have a question here. Could a composer become well-trained without mastering 18th century harmony and counterpoint? Could they, for an instant, use Henry Cowell's dissonant counterpoint as a model in text by Charles Seeger and Vincent Persichetti as a starting point? You were talking about how the architecture education here starts with contemporary language and not starting with classical models.
Right.
What's your feeling with music that way?
Well, I am this actually relates pretty well, because as I mentioned with the Rivers and Ravines piece that I wrote before, certainly I think it's important to be able to identify the elements, or in terms of vocabulary. Like, even if you're studying contemporary architecture, you need to be able to say what's a column and what's a beam. Like, I still need to be able to describe, like, I think that describing things as major or minor or quartile or quintal or none of the above, or something like that, is still very important. Not that you have to be able to categorize or identify everything, but that you need some kind of, if you're going to consider it to be something that you've studied as opposed to something that you just kind of like do by ear or just as an avocation, I think it's important to be able to figure out some way of communicating and describing what it is. Could they start from a different model? Well, I am fairly certain that I heard tonic and dominant harmonies at some point in my life before I wrote music, and I'm being sarcastic because of course I did. But the fact that when I was sitting down to write a piece of music that it happens to be in 5/4, it happened to be in, like, with all sorts of different sorts of harmonic things. I didn't feel that, I never saw harmony and counterpoint as a kind of prerequisite for the creativity. On the other hand, that only worked because I was playing it. I've seen, this goes a different direction than what you're asking, but I want to bring this up. Todd Mackover works in the MIT Media Lab, and I worked for him in this past spring, teaching music in Boston area elementary schools, and their group in the Media Lab has a number of very interesting things with teaching children about different musical compositional sorts of skills. But they have, in their aim to, and I'm very pleased that they have chosen to focus not just on things for virtuosic performers, but also on teaching tools. But it kind of takes one of my criticisms of it would be that it allows this creativity, and actually a lot of the design kinds of things that I would talk about that I talked about a few minutes ago, in terms of what's the overall shape of the piece and all that. It gets right to the heart of that in a very interesting sort of way. But because there's so many layers of hiddenness, the children aren't actually physically playing anything that they also can't identify it as easily. And so I think that going back to how you phrased the question, could they start with, without 18th century things first? Yes. Might they find it incredibly interesting to rediscover it at some point along the way? Absolutely. But that's not an excuse then for saying that it is, that for any sort of lack of rigor or lack of being able to communicate it. Because if it's just, you need to be able to know what the notes are, or how that works. Maybe you'll end up describing it in a very different sort of way. You can describe learning that you could describe something as a quintal harmony, not just as, well, that's as far as my hands can reach, and with the fifth in between. Mm-hmm. That was really cool that there's an actual name for that could be a part of things, and not just an unnamed sort of external sort of thing. But there still needs to be the rigor in being able to describe it in order for it to go further than simply a face value sort of description.
Wow. There's still a lot of questions. Let's see. Let's try some of these and not get too detailed, just so we don't run out of time. You talk about designed elements in the process of composition. Are they necessarily preconceived, and do they change in the course of actual composition? And
sometimes an element can be just simply that there's a particular chord that recurs in a particular register. sometimes it could just be a gesture, an effect, or something like that. I think that it's I don't generally compose and sit down and have like a list of here are my 6 elements that are going to be used in this piece, and they're all on a separate piece of paper and that sort of thing. And then all of a sudden you can see those exact same things recurring. I don't really think it works that way. But the nice thing is when you think about them as elements with a bit of identity, then you don't have to, every time you get to a downbeat or to a climax and you want something like as a kind of landmark to keep the listener, oh, we're now into the next variation, or now we're into something that you don't have to solve every problem from day one again.
Right.
You have to
So
reinvent the wheel.
for you, you don't need a great deal of preconception before you start a piece.
I often do have sketches, but I don't, or like generally about halfway, or not halfway, maybe a third of the way into the piece, that I'll often then have a kind of shorthand that well, now I know it's going to be a piece that's in variation form, and I kind of know where it's going, but I want to get, in order to get to this point by the 6th variation, I know that 4 and 5 are going to have to be really different from what I thought of at the beginning, and something like that. So I think that I do appreciate the value of sketches and that sort of thing along the way, but it's not like available forms or like something like that where there's these kind of discrete sort of things that exist outside the piece and they're kind of floating around. But.
Right. Have you written anything using a dissonant musical language? The scores and the music of yours that I'm familiar with is very third based. It's not always traditional, tonal harmony, but it's very kind of third based. Do you envision anything in the future that may use more kind of dissonant harmony?
If I'll get from second base to third base to home plate or something like that, I don't know. Let's see. There are elements of Were You There, the piano piece, that employ a more clusterish sort of texture. The most recent piano piece that I wrote for my recital that wasn't on the recordings here, I think, it does use some third-based elements, but it ends up being, I would say it's not overly dissonant. There's a lot more uses of strange sevenths and that sort of thing. I guess do I envision that for the future? Many people who listen to my music find it dissonant enough already for them. And depending on the setting for which you're writing music, I've sometimes have allowed, there's one of my church music pieces that has C major, C major, E major, and G major C major, E flat major, and G major superimposed throughout. 3 triads. Yes, it's third based, but those are being combined in a very different sort of way. The one other thing that I would have to mention that might change, like in terms of dissonance or something like that, I started playing viola in the past 6 months, and what dissonance or consonance means on a stringed instrument is entirely different from piano or from a number of other things. I mean, that's another lesson from choir music, is that these chords that you would play on the piano and you'd be like, oh my gosh, what is that trying to be? And you like the end of the Britain War Requiem or something like that. You'd never want to hear that on a piano, and you hear it on a choir. I heard it at Symphony Hall with Seiji Ozawa conducting before he left. And those tritones are so marvelously in tune that all of a sudden the tritone isn't dissonant anymore at all.
Yeah.
And the perfect fourth that it is coming from is, it's you have to resolve out of that. So I think that a continuing exposure to to those sorts of things, that all of a sudden, minor ninths can actually be relatively not dissonant, and that's an important sort of lesson that you'll never get from a piano, really.
To kind of I have some concluding questions. I know I've asked you this before outside of the interview, and it's a tough question, but all the people I've interviewed have found this question still worthwhile. Is there something unique about the educational environment here at MIT that encourages a kind of creativity that might not be found at a more traditional university?
I think part of it is the structural way that the curriculum is set up, that there's an allowance for taking courses outside of one's declared major and a flexibility in being able to choose a major that is not the kind of thing that, if I was applying to Cornell or something like that, which has a very good architecture program and a very good music program, but one applies into that program upon entrance to the university. You do not have the choice or the leeway of switching in the same sort of manner. I suppose it's not impossible, but there's the way that I could enter as an architecture student, take classes in engineering and in urban studies and in physics and everything else, also take classes in music and decide to add another major. I think that one of the biggest strengths of MIT is not just the atmosphere, but that the system is set up to allow for that kind of flexibility. I do think that there are so many multi-talented people here that tends to encourage one to be accepting of or encouraging of one's own many talents, as opposed to trying to be just parceled into one sort of direction. But I think that's I think that it's also that MIT has the faculty and in things like the music library and other entities that are outside of just who's on the list of faculty that help to encourage one to be able to do something like what I've done. That I don't, if I had simply gone to architecture school, it was not an inevitable thing at all that I would have done as much music. And even if I'd come here, and that's not a given. I think it has a lot to do with meeting people in the music library, people like Charles, people like Dante, people like all of these, all the student performers that I've worked with, all of the people that I've, been in performances or on orchestra tour or on, whatever, that you end up learning all sorts of things that way. That, would I have ever known Quincy Porter's compositions if my architecture advisor didn't happen to be his son? Probably not. Mm-hmm. But there's I think there's all sorts of things that way, that it's the people that would make more of the difference as opposed to simply the institute as a kind of grand overall, mysterious abstract entity.
Mm-hmm. Do you find, at least your experience here, that students and people who are trained as scientists or engineers bring a particular kind of creative focus and discipline to their work?
Well, I think that often makes one very diligent and very creative in the sense of being able to play well, being able to have a lot of technical mastery and expressive fluency. That this is a set of skills that that one can be very comfortable with. Doesn't necessarily mean that that's the same thing as compositional creativity, of creating something new.
Right.
And that's not a criticism of my fellow students. I'm just saying that there's many types of creativity at work here, and some of it is more, in effect, recreative, in the sense that this person can, play an incredible, set of, he's an outstanding second violinist. This person has been, first chair flute of this, that, and the other thing. This person, that they're very, outstanding musicians in that way, but they could be great collaborators in a compositional effort, but it's not the same thing as that those people, because they're great musicians, would instantly be skilled at composing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that sometimes those are lumped together, that that all these sorts of people are musically creative. Mm-hmm. And that's true in a general sense, but literally creating something new is not always. And sometimes, I would, at this point, I'm a better composer than I am a performer in many regards. Mm-hmm. And I know that there are certain performance things that are just not my strength due to, what my technical strengths are. Those are two sides of a coin. It's not that both of them are necessarily go together.
Right. One last concluding question. Besides being a place of employment for 4 years, how would you describe the MIT Lewis Music Library's role in your musical education and development? I know that's an unfair question, but...
Well, since I'm having this interview in the Lewis Music Library, and that I've been here, it's not often that one finds a place that is influential on so many different aspects of one's education. A place as in terms of like both a physical place, in terms of that, but also as like what all the attributes are of the library. I mean, I came here and I very much liked being in libraries, but I'd not been a library worker like at the public library at home or something like that. And being able to learn, like, to be more familiar with basic sort of like desk person, office friendly, helpful sorts of skills. These are, I guess, are going to be kind of run-on sentences as usual, but the thing is that it allowed me to understand, okay, well, this is what it's like to work with, the people like Forrest and Christine, Peter, who are in charge and all the different responsibilities and projects that you have, and trying to work with that. Also, like, with the other students, being trained by someone like Jason Krug, who had been here for so long, and learning that, wow, this is something that this isn't just a campus job that, helps towards, grocery money or whatever, that this is something that you can really get some learning benefit out of as well. What was quite unexpected was that the music library would end up being so much of a part of other things that I ended up doing these display cases for it, and sometimes had some of my own photographs alongside other things. I had learning about the whole way that music is organized, and that became so helpful for things like senior seminar or for other music classes, in terms of trying to understand what are the organizational issues of musical scholarship, of like if one is writing a composition and one gives it a title, what does that really mean from the perspective of how it might be made available to other people? What are the different ways that that you can find new pieces that you've never even thought of? Also, that simply the sheer depth and breadth of the collection is something that has really been such a big part of broadening my musical vocabulary and interests and such. From it's one thing to take a class in African music, it's another thing to have a class in African music and have African music to listen to. That it's one thing to to talk about or read about these various pieces, but when you really have recordings, and really good recordings of what they are, or really good scores, or the manuscript of this, that, and the other thing, there's a whole different level. And then that really kind of all came together with when I worked with cataloging the Stephen Prokopov donation, that you have this music that is often quite obscure, and that here I'm applying the kind of logistical, organizational, library skills sorts of things in terms of assigning call numbers and figuring out how it should be organized. But then realizing that this could be a real connection to Lois Craig, to her late husband, to all of the performing aspects, that this was music that needed to be heard in real life and in person. And so I ended up organizing the concert and doing the program and all the different sorts of things, and ended up playing in it as well. And I guess I'm stating that kind of casually, but it was a lot of, like, this was a project that ended up occurring over about 10 months from the summer until this past spring. And it's really, I mean, working in the music library is not simply about, like, the fact that I have a lot of call numbers memorized, or that some point someone came in and couldn't find a piece and asked if they could hum it to me and if I could find it. And it ended up being the Gypsy Airs by Sarasate, and he was looking for a violin concerto, and you'll never find that under violin concerto. And I could find it, and why I happen to know that, I have no idea. But that's not exactly what, I mean, those are fun aspects of music library life, or the fact that we have Beanie Babies that have catalog numbers. But I think that it's being able to have a place that has a rich enough collection and that has helpful enough people, and learning that can, that was so much of, being a composer is not just about writing your own stuff, but that, seeing how other people have written music, being whether it was singing in a piece or playing in a piece or something, that it's not just that this is like the music library is I don't want to say that it's like a crutch, or that it's like something to fall back on if, like, I didn't know something. It's you get so much of an added perspective by having the wealth of material and experience, and that's sort of thing to work from. And it's definitely something that I have missed since I have been gone for even a few months, and it's something that I will continue to miss. But it also means that I now understand, these are the types of ways that, as I'm looking for new pieces to play or looking for new things to learn from, that these are the types of ways that, when I, finding, there are other music libraries or at other institutions, of being able to understand, how to really use library resources well. It's not just, a repository or a place that stuff happens to live, but that it's something much more interesting and exciting than that. Mm-hmm. But it's a really big honor that you would have asked me as a music student, but also as a library person, to then come back and be on the other side of the microphone or whatever, and on the other side of the coin, to be able to be part of this oral history project. And that's something that's you've worked on a lot, and it's these kinds of interesting peripheral projects that are part of what make the music library a really interesting place. Mm-hmm. I think that one way that I was mentioning that I've learned so much from both the types of the literal tasks of working at a library desk and learning how to help people find the music that they need, both students and faculty. I've also learned so much from working with Peter and yourself, Forrest, and Christy, who all of you have various musical interests that are quite different, and that are that it's helpful to see how different people, the music library itself is the same, but that each of you have a very different perspective on it. What was quite unexpected was that the music library would end up being so much of a part of other things. That I ended up doing these display cases for it, and sometimes had some of my own photographs alongside other things. I had learning about the whole way that music is organized, and that became so helpful for things like senior seminar or for other music classes, in terms of trying to understand what are the organizational issues of musical scholarship, of, like, if one is writing a composition and one gives it a title, what does that really mean from the perspective of how it might be made available to other people? What are the different ways that that you can find new pieces that you've never even thought of? Also, that simply the sheer depth and breadth of the collection is something that has really been such a big part of broadening my musical vocabulary and interests and such. From it's one thing to take a class in African music, it's another thing to have a class in African music and have African music to listen to. That it's one thing to to talk about or read about these various pieces, but when you really have recordings, and really good recordings of what they are, or really good scores, or the manuscript, or this, that, and the other thing, there's a whole different level And then that really kind of all came together with when I worked with cataloging the Stephen Prokopov donation, that you have this music that is often quite obscure, and that here I'm applying the kind of logistical, organizational, library skills sorts of things in terms of assigning call numbers and figuring out how it should be organized. But then realizing that this could be a real connection to Lois Craig, to her late husband, to all of the performing aspects, that this was music that needed to be heard in real life and in person. And so I ended up organizing the concert and doing the program and all the different sorts of things, and ended up playing in it as well. And I guess I'm stating that kind of casually, but it was a lot of, this was a project that ended up occurring over about 10 months from the summer until this past spring. And it's really, working in the music library is not simply about the fact that I have a lot of call numbers memorized, or that some point someone came in and couldn't find a piece and asked if they could hum it to me and if I could find it. And it ended up being the Gypsy Airs by Sarasate, and he was looking for a violin concerto, and you'll never find that under violin concerto. And I could find it, and why I happen to know that, I have no idea. But that's not exactly what, those are fun aspects of music library life, or the fact that we have Beanie Babies that have catalog numbers. But I think that it's being able to have a place that has a rich enough collection and that has helpful enough people, and learning that can, that was so much of, being a composer is not just about writing your own stuff, but that, seeing how other people have written music, being a, whether it was singing in a piece or playing in a piece or something, that it's not just that this is the music library is I don't want to say that it's like a crutch, or that it's something to fall back on if I didn't know something. It's you get so much of an added perspective by having the wealth of material and experience, and that's sort of thing to work from. And it's definitely something that I have missed since I have been gone for even a few months, and it's something that I will continue to miss. But it also means that I now understand, these are the types of ways that, as I'm looking for new pieces to play or looking for new things to learn from, that these are the types of ways that when I finding there are other music libraries or at other institutions, of being able to understand how to really use library resources well. That it's not just a repository or a place that stuff happens to live, but that it's something much more interesting and exciting than that. Mm-hmm. But it's a really big honor that you would have asked me as a music student, but also as a library person, to then come back and be on the other side of the microphone or whatever, and on the other side of the coin, to be able to be part of this oral history project. And that's something that's you've worked on a lot, and it's these kinds of interesting peripheral projects that are part of what make the music library a really interesting place.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's been a real honor and privilege to have you this afternoon, and there's so many other questions that I wish I could have asked you, and I trust that sometime in the future we can have you back for another interview. But thank you so much, David.
Oh, you're very welcome.